guys, let's get going on the last video of our Unit 1, and we're going to pick up where we left off talking about absorption in the large intestine. Now, by the time our food gets down to our large intestine, only about 10% of the absorption is left to do. 90% of what we've digested and absorbed is going to happen in the small intestine. Okay, that's the largest, longest organ. It's got the most surface area, and it's specialized in absorption. When we get into the large intestine, again, it's specialized in absorption, but there's only a few things left for us to absorb. The primary thing we're looking at is absorbing water, but we'll also absorb bile salts, vitamins, ions, and also some waste products as well. Now this graphic here, this slide, the picture on this slide is a fantastic review for you guys. So if we think about a meal, food and drink, and we take in around 200 milliliters or 2 liters of food with our meal in the run of a day. In the run of a day, we're going to have 1,500 milliliters of saliva that's going to go into the digestive system, another 1,500 milliliters of gastric secretions in the stomach, another 200 milliliters or 2 liters of intestinal secretions. We're going to have a liter of bile go in there, and we're going to have a liter of pancreatic juice get into, by the time we get down through the small intestine, through the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine, we get around 9 liters of food and water going into our digestive system per day on average. Now, in our small intestine, we're going to do a lot of absorption. You can see here the white arrows, everything is coming out of in the small intestine, and it's being reabsorbed back into the tissues of the digestive system. By the time we pass through the ileocecal valve and we get into the large intestine, so here's our cecum here, we're going to add another 200 milliliters or so of mucus, and by the time we get down to our colon, we're going to have 1.4 liters of food and water that we need to reabsorb. Now, as you can see here, tons of stuff being reabsorbed across the large intestine, and by the time we get down to it at the end of the day, we're going to have about 150 milliliters of volume of feces. Now that's down from 9 liters. So we go from 9,000 milliliters down to 150. So we can see how good our large intestines, or our digestive tract in particular, is good at absorbing nutrients, ions, water. All those things will move, and there'll be a lot of different mechanisms on how it moves, through active transport, through diffusion, through simple processes, and through much more complicated process. But absorption of water is going to be key in terms of when we're thinking about what the function of the large intestine is. We're also going to absorb our vitamins here too. So our fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K, those are going to be dissolved into my cells, and which can then be absorbed by diffusion across the intestinal wall. So there's a little extra step to the fat soluble ones. The water soluble vitamins, those are going to be easily absorbed by diffusion right across the intestinal wall. So vitamins B and C, for example, really easily, readily absorbed. Now, there is an exception, and that's vitamin B12. Now, vitamin B12 has to be bound to intrinsic factor. And when it does, it gets actively transported in. So that's how we absorb vitamin B12. Now, the question here is, what digestive structure releases intrinsic factor? And I will leave that question up to you guys to look up. You're going to need to go back and probably review, let me give you, I'll say the stomach. Have a look at that, and that'll give you an idea of where to look for that, that structure. Now, I don't expect you guys to remember this stuff out here at all, but what I do want to point out on this slide is the fact that the large intestine can use a lot of these different transport mechanisms in order to get stuff across the cell wall. So these are some ions, bile salts, different things that will be present in the large intestine that we need to transport. You can see here the ion will go across the mucosa and into the interstitial fluid, and then this is showing you how it'll work. So we can have diffusion, we can have active transport, you can have carrier-mediated transport, all these different ways for us to get the materials that we need from our food back across our intestinal wall. Now, peristalsis is going to carry on right throughout our digestive system. We've already talked about this in the stomach. We've talked about it in the small intestine, and it's going to be no different when we get into the large intestine. Gastroileal and gastroenteric reflexes are going to move material into the cecum, so it's going to take it from the small intestine into the cecum, and that's going to have that represents the end of the small intestine and the beginning of the large intestine. So after your meal, peristalsis will increase as food moves through the digestive tract. As long as food's present, peristalsis will keep up. That's going to force the climb from the stomach into the small intestine, and finally from the small intestine into the cecum. Once the food enters the cecum and it moves into the colon, the movement is going to be slow. And the reason why it's slow is we keep the food or the developing feces in the colon for a long time, so that we get lots of time to absorb as much water and as much nutrients as we possibly can. Since if we think about the anatomy of this large intestine, so we've got really large diameter organ, and we get a relatively thin cell wall, so it's quite a big empty space. We're going to need some pretty powerful contractions in order to move that material from the transverse colon to the rest of the large intestine. So these peristaltic contractions, they're going to push food through the transverse colon. It'll obviously a bit easier to go down the descending colon when they get into the sigmoid colon, but these contractions are going to force the feces into the rectum, which is the end of the large intestine, and that's going to produce a defecation reflex. So the rectum is the last 15 centimeters of the digestive tract, and it's an expandable organ, and its prime function is to store fecal matter or feces. Once the peristaltic movements have pushed the feces into the rectum, it's going to cause a defecation reflex. It's going to cause an urge in your body. It lets you know that there's food present in the rectum and it needs to go. So you're going to have that urge to defecate. If we look at the very end of the digestive tract, we've got our sigmoid colon ending up right here. We move into the rectum, and then the last part of the rectum is the anal canal. So that's the the last part of the digestive tube, and then the opening to the outside is going to be the anus. Once food reaches the rectum, this is when we're going to have that rectal or that defecation reflex kick in. Now, at the end of the digestive tract, at the end of the anus, the rectum, we're going to have two sets of sphincter muscles. We're going to have an internal anal sphincter and an external anal sphincter. The internal one is involuntary. We cannot control this. This is done with smooth muscle, and it's governed by our nervous system. Our external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle, and we can control that external sphincter muscle. So we can relax that and allow us to use the bathroom mostly when we want to. So if we just look at this diagram here, this is our defecation reflex. First thing that's going to happen are we're going to have stretch receptors in the rectum, and once those are triggered, it's going to send an information to the brain that says, okay, there's feces present and we need to get rid of it. So by reflex, without you controlling it, what's going to happen is the internal anal sphincter is going to relax and feces is going to move deeper into the rectum. What's left then, so all of this stuff inside this box is stuff that's completely out of your control. You can't control that at all. What's left then is the voluntary part of the defecation reflex, and that is the external anal sphincter. We can control this particular muscle, And when we relax this particular muscle, that's when we're actually going to defecate. So when we relax, that sphincter will open up, and then the feces can exit the body. So there's two parts to the defecation reflex. There's the involuntary part that we cannot control, and then there's the voluntary part which we can control. And finally, in order for defecation to occur, both sphincters have to be relaxed. So the involuntary one is going to be relaxed by reflex, and then the voluntary external anal sphincter will be relaxed voluntarily when you're ready to use the bathroom. And that is the end of Unit 1.